Also, this week we will be reading part of the cons of marriage is how your book defines the piece that we are reading by Daniel Defoe. This very he'd look great in an 80s hairband, I think. But Daniel Defoe is a literary giant from the 18th century. But despite his I guess legacy and notoriety today, little is known about his kind of origins. The date of his birth is uncertain. However, despite all of that, Defoe led a full, productive, and interesting life. He was born Daniel Foe. He was the son of a candle maker and was educated for the Protestant ministry. But by his marriage in 1684, he was established as a hosiery merchant. So he very much comes from the middle class. He is a middle class born and bred author who found he really represents the middle class, and you'll see that in his writing. We'll talk about that a little bit more in just a second. But sometime around 1695, Daniel added the "duh" to his family name, often seen as an indicative on his part for his desire for upward social mobility. Defoe is very much representative of the new 18th century British middle class in that his writings are grounded in middle class sensibilities and concerns, and they were intended mainly for like-minded middle class audience. Defoe's fortunes in politics and in several business ventures had cycles of extreme highs and extreme lows. He was in and out of debt. He was accused of dishonesty in business. He was an earnest man who worked hard and long all his life. He traveled Europe extensively. He was pilloried and twice imprisoned for offending the government. He participated in armed rebellion. He switched party allegiances and worked as a propagandist and secret agent paid to identify disloyal citizens from 1703 to 1714. And through all his various occupations, his very colorful and interesting life, Defoe was first and foremost a prolific and very successful journalist and writer of pamphlets and books on subjects ranging from politics to morality to genteel conduct in the bedroom to travel and geography to economics. Defoe wrote seemingly about everything, and in all, Defoe is credited with writing more than 550 published books, journals, and pamphlets. And though his contribution to the novel was sometimes downplayed in the 18th and 19th centuries because it was such a base, low, new kind of medium, 20th century literary historians and critics have come to recognize Defoe as one of the most important founding fathers or primary parents of the modern novel. And his most important contributions to the development of fiction include especially realistic detail in external, physical description and attention to realism in presentation, which Samuel Johnson would appreciate because remember, the novel and fiction is all about presenting real, ordinary people in ordinary circumstances. And none of Defoe's fiction at the time bore his name on the title page. All of his novels were presented to and sometimes received by the public as real life autobiographies of their main characters. So we'll talk about that more in just a second. He writes in plain literary prose considered eminently readable in his time. His effective projection of himself with vivid, convincing imagination into the various protagonists who narrate their respective fictional autobiographies, and some consider Daniel Defoe to be the first English novelist. Whether or not his fictions were novels, his innovations in fictions do certainly make him a giant in the history of the novel, which we will talk about more in just a second and extensively next week. His most famous work that you are probably the most familiar with is Robinson Crusoe, about the marooned Robinson Crusoe on the island. But he's also wrote novels called Moll Flanders, which is a really good book about a prostitute who finds her way to Virginia, Colonel Jack, and Roxana. So the Cons of Marriage is part of the larger work, the part of the larger novel of Roxana. And Roxana is like a 500-page novel. But we are only reading a small portion of that as it relates to this kind of question about women and marriage, a la Mary Astle. So the Cons of Marriage, like I said, comes from the novel. And you'll notice, like what I was talking about a few minutes ago, the kind of title page, and this is not the cover of Roxana, but this is a publication of it from the 18th century. It is called The Life and Adventures of Roxana, the Fortunate Mistress or Most Unhappy Wife, in 3 parts. So the important thing to note about this, the fact that this is coming from a novel, is that it is written in an epistolary style. And what that means is that it was written as a series of letters, because in its kind of infancy, novels were not considered to be viable works of literature because they were just that, fiction. And in order to make them look better, or make them look more, what's the word I'm looking for? Respectable. That's not really the word that I want to use, but in order to make them look like respectable works, they were published as the guise of autobiographical accounts of real people. So you'll notice that a lot of the earlier novels, the first novels, were written as people's names, like Samuel Richardson's Clarissa. Belinda is a novel by Maria Edgeworth. Camilla by Frances Burney, Roxana, Pamela, Moll Flanders, Tristram Shandy. The list goes on, and even some of Jane Austen's earlier works were originally published under the names of characters. For example, Sense and Sensibility was originally called Eleanor and Marianne, and Northanger Abbey, which we are going to read in the next couple of weeks, was originally titled Susan. So this idea that novels were given characters' names, is a means of giving them this guise or this facade of truth and of pseudo-autobiographical accounts. Anyways, Roxana is, like I said, an epistolary novel, but in order to kind of understand the Cons of Marriage, the section that you are reading for today, you have to kind of understand the context of where we're coming from within the novel. Roxana is written from her point of view, and Roxana is a beautiful and ambitious courtesan, and that's a nice term for a prostitute, but she's not just any prostitute. She is a courtesan is very different. A courtesan is a woman for wealthy men, which we'll talk about when we have our larger class discussion. But she is a prostitute. She has sex with men for money, and that's how she makes her career. She had been in a marriage previously to her courtesan days, and that marriage turned sour and led her into poverty, which forced her into this kind of career of prostitution. And the cons of marriage is a conversation with a wealthy merchant lover. So that's where we're picking up with the cons of marriage. And really, this is her, where she's kind of like the opposite of the wife of Bath in that she is advocating for her singlehood, her freedom, rather than the institution of marriage. So I'm going to stop here, and I'm going to talk in one more video on William Hogarth, and then this will be kind of food for thought for you all as you read the literature for our class discussion. So stay tuned.